I'd been hearing quite a lot about Anya Alborn's brother on social media before I decided to check it out. This book has been on the lips of horror readers for a good while now. Increasingly so, I would argue. And so I finally decided to read it, and at first, I wasn't disappointed, but I was kind of confused. Because the narrative surrounding this book is that it is enormously unsettling. It is distressing, it is disturbing, it is almost nauseating. And you know, the funny thing is, for the first 3/4 of this book, I actually thought it was kind of wholesome in the weirdest way possible. And that is still true. But before I go on, I want to say I'm not going to be spoiling the ending. I'm going to keep this as spoiler-free as possible. That said, when you get to the final quarter, all the things that people say about this book become clear. A lot is saved for the ending, and that is often true for horror. I read and watch and play a lot of horror stuff. But the fact that this book is so borderline wholesome for quite a while, or at least hopeful, if not wholesome, at least as horror goes, almost starts to feel like a red herring. It is distracting. I'm not going to call it dishonest, because it's very cleverly woven into the narrative. Brother is a fantastic horror novel, but it certainly lets you sit in hope for a while, for a little bit longer than is arguably fair. But once again, horror isn't fair, and this is very, very well written and very well realised. And another sign that this is one of those truly distressing and disturbing horror novels is that it has sat with me for a few days. I finished this book maybe 3 days ago at the time of recording. I spent the weekend with my in-laws for my partner's birthday, and I spent every free moment I had thinking about this book, thinking about its effect on me. I'd fall asleep thinking about this book. And so if you haven't read it and you're interested, by the end of this video you decide to go out and check this book out, you'll also be confused by how it could be so distressing and traumatizing and upsetting, etc. But you'll get there. So let's talk about it. What is Brother? Brother is a 2015 horror novel by Polish-American author Anya Alborn. It is the only book of hers I've read so far, and I was very excited to check it out based on the hype. And as a kind of masochistic horror fan, I was ready to be upset. I was ready to be traumatized, and I was ready to feel some kind of a catharsis at the end. But this is a uniquely disturbing horror novel in the sense that you don't really get catharsis at the end, because instead you spend the whole novel feeling hopeful until everything gets dropped on you like a ton of bricks. This book is set, I'm gonna say, somewhere in the 80s, based on the pop culture references that you get peppered throughout the story. It's a very unique horror novel in the sense that it flips the script on the cannibalistic hillbilly trope established by the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Wrong Turn, and The Hills Have Eyes. Our protagonist, Michael Morrow, is the youngest boy in a family of hill-dwelling, isolated, murderous, cannibalistic hillbillies. The novel opens with Michael trying to distract himself and drown out the screaming from a kidnapped girl who is currently being butchered by his mother, who is very much the head of the family. Michael is a sensitive teenager. He doesn't like this stuff. He'd rather not be part of this family. He has an older brother called Reb, which is short for Rebel and is not his real name, but it establishes immediately that Rebel, although he's a psychopath, is also kind of a loser. Reb is very much his mother's son, and arguably worse, because their mother is almost a mindless killer. There isn't that nasty, torturous, psychopathic streak in her that you see in more campy villains, like Hannibal Lecter or DC's The Joker. She isn't like that. She's a force of nature. She likes killing and eating people. That's kind of it. She doesn't have many lines. She is just a terrifying monster thing to fear. You don't get a real description of her. Her real name is only mentioned a few times. She's a monster in the shadows. She has her hooks in everyone. Everyone in the family, including her husband, are all afraid of her, and they all go out and they kidnap people for her to have her way with. And while it's never explicitly stated, this family eats a lot of red meat. So Michael doesn't like his situation, and he is our protagonist. We see most of the story through his eyes, although not all of it. And he also has a sister called Misty. Misty also doesn't like this life. She is also a sensible and sensitive person. She loves music, she listens to records, and a lot of what she listens to is from the 50s and 60s, and that makes them feel like they are lost in time. But as the blurb says, eventually Michael and Rebel make their way into town. There is a local town called Dahlia, not much goes on there, and it's a place for them to scope out potential victims. Not that Michael wants to be doing that. But not too far into the novel, they walk into a local record store, and they meet two girls called Lucy and Alice. Rebel immediately manages to seduce and charm Lucy into having a casual sexual fling. But Michael and Alice form a pretty strong connection, and there is hope in her for him. Alice represents possibility. This is where the hope and the wholesome quality of this book come in. Michael's sensitivity in the face of what surrounds him every single day is kind of wholesome, and Alice represents a kind of hope for him, because she's from a small town and she dreams of getting out, going to any big city. Michael keeps his life very, very secret, his family very, very secret, and he appears as a kind of innocent blank slate. Alice is able to recommend him music, recommend him clothing and fashion, get him clued in on pop culture. They go see a film at the local cinema at one point, and he's never done that before. Alice enjoys bonding with him. He's sweet, and she is a confident young woman who has dreams, is doubtful that those dreams could be realized, but the two of them can put their heads together a little bit. They can represent hope for each other. She shows him that there is life outside of this farmhouse full of cannibals, and he gives her that little extra push that maybe she can get out. Maybe she has a bright future, or at least a more interesting one. And while this novel is peppered with very unsettling things like Michael helping his brother kidnap victims, and a scene very, very early on, in fact it might be in the first chapter, where the girl who is screaming on the very first page escapes, and Michael, who is very, very tall and very, very fast, chases her through the woods and catches her and apologizes and says he has no choice, drags her back. That's a powerful opening. But in spite of that, and many other scenes like it, it still feels kind of hopeful and wholesome because of this focus on Alice and what future Michael might have. Another thing we learn early on that helps you separate Michael from the family is the fact that he's actually adopted. Although adopted might be the wrong word. He was kidnapped. We learn this in an early flashback scene from Rebel's perspective. Rebel kidnapped Michael from his family home for a specific reason. There was another child in this family, the eldest girl. And Rebel was very attached to his sister, and she was thinking about running away from this family, which is a common feeling that everyone seems to share. Rebel, being his mother's son and a complete psychopath, wants to find a way to keep her. So he kidnaps a boy that she can then kind of raise as her cute little brother, but she leaves anyway, and Rebel takes all of that out on Michael. Michael is raised in this family. He doesn't remember what came before because he was like 4 years old when this happened. But the fact that he's not blood related to this family helps you feel like there's more hope for him, like he won't inherit their tendencies. The way that Rebel, whose real name is Ray by the way, has inherited his mother's behaviour, her thirst for blood and meat. So the novel opens with a lot of really horrific stuff. It establishes what the family is like, it gives all of them personalities, and you start to bond with Michael because, as I keep saying, he's very sensitive. He's a sweet boy in spite of it all. We get flashback scenes that build his character, but especially build Rebel's character. Rebel is kind of unique in that psychopathic trope because we really get to know him. I compared him to the Joker before, and that's a fair comparison, but we don't know anything about the Joker. The Joker sits somewhere between Rebel and his mother. We never learn anything about this matriarch. That's why she's so terrifying. She is an anonymous force of nature, a murderous, cannibalistic thing. But Rebel, we get to know. And what's so dark and frightening about him is that we get to know him, and he's worse than his mother, because he's smart. Kind of. He is vindictive. He is manipulative. He's savvy. He's not an intelligent person. He's not empathetic, but he's savvy. He's sneaky. He's conniving. And that makes him more dangerous than his mother, who actually needs the family. They go out and hunt and bring things back for her, and the only tools she has in her arsenal is fear and intimidation. They do what she says because she's frightening. Her husband is dreadfully apathetic to the point that he's almost comic relief. He isn't, but he could be. If this was adapted to a film, you could see him being a slightly funny character. Because of the way that he sits in the corner reading a newspaper while his wife does what she does, frightens the children into obeying her and doing awful criminal things for her. It's a really interesting family dynamic. They are all written brilliantly, but not just as individuals, but also their relationships with each other. Michael and Misty have a unique bond as brother and sister. And again, when I say that this is a unique bond, I think you know what I'm saying. Misty is damaged by this family, both in the sense that she's been traumatized by it, but also she has succumbed to the morals and ethics that she's been injected with. They're not good morals or good ethics, but they're what she has. This family is so fantastically well written. Everything is established very, very clearly in the first act. The second act throws you so much hope and positivity and borderline wholesomeness, and then you get to the third act. That's when everything comes to a head. And it is terrifying. It is frightening. And I think what's so unique about this is horror is often from the perspective of victims. When you watch a horror film or read a horror novel, you bond with victims. That's usually what horror is. That is the horror formula. These are frightened, vulnerable people in a difficult situation, maybe one that is dark and claustrophobic, where they are facing an unknown and deadly threat. They're in a haunted house. They're in a city full of zombies. They're being tortured. I don't know, whatever it is. That's usually the horror formula, but here, it's kind of reversed. Michael is a part of this family, trusted by default, but eager to escape. And so you get to know the villains before you get to know any kind of heroes. Or rather than heroes, I guess I should say victims. Michael is kind of both. He's not innocent because he hasn't had a choice. He was raised in this. But he is still a victim. That is made very, very clear. So because this novel doesn't have that typical victim who is wrong-footed and vulnerable and being chased by something kind of a dynamic, it doesn't feel inherently frightening. You're not scared to turn the page for what you might see or what dangers the protagonist might suddenly be up against. But it's also not really psychological either. It sits somewhere in between the more crass, aggressive kind of horror and the more subtle psychological horror. It really is its own unique thing. And because of the way you get to know these people so intimately, and because of the events of the third act, I really think that this is the most distressing horror story I've ever read. It's certainly one that's going to stick with me, and I think it's one that is so expertly written, especially when it comes to its characters and their relationships. I really bonded with these people for better or worse. They live in my mind now. There is a space for them. There is a room in my brain for these people. And I'm happy and very unhappy about that all at the same time. Brother is a wonderfully unique story. I didn't think it was going to be this special, this unsettling and disturbing, and this well crafted. I'm amazed. I am really grateful to Anya Alborn for creating something so powerfully unique and exciting and just beautifully executed. If you're a horror fan and you haven't read Brother, you cannot miss it. Do not skip on this novel and subscribe for books.